Hi, I'm James Catherall, founder of Catherall Audio, and I got a chance to sit down with two awesome DCI audio engineers. One of them is Luke Vogt, who's one of the lead audio staff members at the Santa Clara Vanguard, and the other one is Matthew Black, who's the sound designer and one of the lead audio staff members at the Cavaliers. We got to sit down and talk about all kinds of different philosophies, how they structure their summer, how their team is put together, all different kinds of things that go into their sound designing and creating their show, and some awesome things that you can look out for in their shows this summer. So, without further ado, here's my conversation with them. I guess we'll start off, giving a little bit of a backstory of maybe starting with your official title of your involvement with Vanguard, and then kind of what got you to this place of where you are right now.
Cool. So yeah, my official title with the Corps is the sound team manager. So I started with the group actually in the COVID season when we did our Wait For Me recording. And my day job is in the Dallas-Fort Worth area as a percussion director. And so I was in the area and I'd already done some recordings for local groups that year for WGI and things like that. And got the call from Paul and that team to come do the recording up at UNT for that summer's version of the drum corps. And then from there, the relationship started. I jumped on the road with them for my first season in 2022. I have to get my years right. And then this year, I'm joining back in as with the managerial role. And a lot of my job is just doing kind of a lot of the big picture stuff, the spreadsheets. We have an awesome team of folks that I count on a lot to, we put all the nuts and bolts together and get all the details right. But my job title is very much spreadsheets, inventory, making sure the scheduling is good, making sure that we have everything we need when we need it, and things like that.
So I guess, do you kind of see yourself, are you going to be a lot of boots on the ground type, or do you kind of see an in and out type of deal?
Yeah. So my summer schedule is I don't know what it is compared to maybe other people in kind of similar roles. I'm doing about 4 or 5 weeks over the summer. And mostly just due to my job as a band director. So we have band camp restrictions on both sides of the summer and things like that. So I'll do 4 to 5 weeks. Again, I have a team of folks that I are awesome, and they're going to do a ton of big stints that I can totally trust them with. But yeah, at the beginning, I'll be there for the majority of all days, doing the build out here next week, and kind of helping run that with the rest of the crew. And then, but yeah, in terms of that, not super in and out, but depending on different people's schedule, definitely not the entire summer.
My name is Matthew Black. I'm the audio capture manager and sound designer for the Cavaliers. I'm one of the band directors at Carmel High School, percussion director. Write lots of marching band shows with lots of really good friends, and fortunate to get to do that. I started with the Cavaliers 2 years ago, the year after COVID. Just came in and helped Ruben as an engineer that just kind of sprinkled in his help. Did some help with the sound design stuff, help with creating the main stage stuff. I've worked with Mike McIntosh for a really long time. He was my high school percussion director when I was a student at Carmel, which is funny. And Richard Saucedo was my band director. He was not the brass arranger at the time, but is now. Cliff Walker is my front ensemble arranger at Carmel, so it's kind of a fun team that we've put together designing music, and it feels like home getting to work and write with those guys. I am slowly handing off, not even slowly, handing off a lot of the audio caption managerial roles to Nick Mason, our lead engineer, who also manages Music City Drum Corps, who you had on a podcast previously. He is really, really smart, and I have a lot of soft skills, and he has a lot of deep skills in the audio engineer side. So I'm overseeing a lot of the logistics and kind of trying to get out of Nick's way as I find more and more of his talents and ways that I can utilize him. But like everybody else, I'm trying to help navigate how we're going to build out the system, what equipment we're going to use. That was kind of in place before I got here. Ruben had established all that, so I didn't have to build a system from the ground up. From then to now, I'm kind of just implementing whatever we need from the show design based on the system that he put together. Did an amazing job. Now he's at Phantom Regiment. Incredible guy. So that's pretty much where we're at. I spend most of my time on the road with the other designers. So through the entire summer, we have an A1 and an A2, somebody that can be down low, somebody can be up top, somebody can run back to the truck whenever the brass inevitably forgets the power cable that runs the whole show. Not that that happened last year or anything. So we've got that, and I'm there on top of that. So typically I'm in the box and I'm trying to be balance ensemble mixing guy rather than boots on the ground guy after we get on the road. So I like to spend during move-ins, and I'm so fortunate because their move-ins is about 2.5 hours away. And so I can just pop over there and pop back. So I try and spend 2-3 days a week out there, and that works really well so that I'm forest through the trees guy, that I can also keep a pulse on everything going on.
That's great. I mean, that actually really, it was a great segue, and sort of the next topic was kind of the broad overlook as far as like the system and how things go throughout the season. I guess like talking just a bit, maybe kind of seeing how much we end up talking about it, but kind of just starting with like preseason and move-ins. I guess as far as like how do you guys plan out move-ins? Like what is usually the goals? What kind of stuff you trying to get done? And I guess, and probably like the big one is what makes it feel like a successful move-ins by the end. Like on the last day you're heading out on a tour and it's like, cool, move-ins was great because we got all these things done. Like usually what's your guys' approach?
I know a lot of drum corps like to wire before they get on tour, so they'll do that in the warehouse. We do not do that. There's not a ton of space in our warehouse to make that happen, but one of the things that's really nice about our move-ins is we have dorms with kind of unlimited room. And during the first week of tour at the Cavaliers, it's mostly spent on fundamental building for the members of exercises and getting the show music really in their hands and getting the marching technique really down. And so there's not a lot of time that we would be able to balance and mix anyways. And so what we do is we have all the audio team that's close enough they can drive in and stay for the first 5-6 days, and we get everything wired, and then we get a baseline mix for the show. Basically a scene that can be the starting place for everything else. We create a few presets. We get all of our soloists that we know we're going to get a really nice line level, good sound out of the soloists. One of the things that I like doing is recording those soloists in the console so that you can then go in and play with them in the future, doing a recorded sound check situation. So that happens in the first week. And just establishing protocol and training our new staff members. We've had great fortune in having interns that have come in that spend time with us during move-ins whenever we're there, and they have grown into being engineers for us every time. And so that's worked really, really well. But this time really for us is inventorying, like you're talking about. They bring all of our stuff that we have at the warehouse, and it all lives in the band room or choir room at the college that we're at. And so at that point, we create a bin inventory, which is all of our bins that are either going to go on the truck with us or go home. And so that is really our first 5 days. Nick Mason helps a lot with the actual wiring portion. I'm usually taking care of the synth side of things. We have a really cool share program set up between Carmel High School and the Cavaliers, where Carmel High School owns a really nice redundant system, Mac Mini system, and Cavaliers have the line arrays. And rather than each of us purchasing those kind of high expense items, we use their line arrays in the fall, and they use our redundant Mac Mini system and a couple channels of wireless in the summer, which is really nice. So I'm usually make the main stage rig run, and Nick is usually get the mix bass level guy.
Yeah, that's super cool. Definitely nice having that share system with a high school is huge. I mean, I know for sure, like last year for us at Blue Knights that we ended up doing that was huge, is we rented a bunch of gear from Ayala High School. And that one was huge for us. We rented like, I want to say we rented like 14 wireless receivers, because they own like 19, just as their high school, they own 19 QLXD4. So we ended up renting a bunch of stuff, and that was huge. It's like, because I know some people there, and so I was able just to like ask them, and they were super down, and that was huge. Is having that type of connection exactly for that reason, and like having that mutual beneficial, because like especially with a high school is perfect, because like a drum corps needs the stuff during the summer, and then it's just going to sit in a warehouse after that, and that's the perfect time for a marching band, is then you just pass it off to a marching band, because it's like, yeah, it's literally just going to sit in a warehouse right now. So then you just hand it to them, and then they can use all that stuff. Is huge. Being able to have those types of connections between a high school and a drum corps helps out a lot,
especially with wireless, especially as we got backed up with the factory burning down in 2020 that made it to where none of us could get anything audio for a while there. Wireless rentals were just so out of control. I remember when Blue Coat started doing all of the wireless performers. I remember the dollar figure that was, and they're well connected in the audio industry, and they have some connections there that they're able to access some rentals at a good price. But it's like 2.5 times now, just in 4 years, what it used to cost now versus then. So creating those share systems between high schools and drum corps should happen more, for sure, or universities or indoor groups, because we're all spending a lot of money on this stuff, and we could lighten the load for sure.
And I guess kind of like understanding what you're talking about, the mixing side. So you'd say that like more of the fine tuning is happening on tour, and you're trying to just kind of get everything established for move-ins and just kind of getting it into like a functional state essentially. And then you'll really kind of start like getting the details out and getting like the fine brush for the excavating out during tour is kind of the main goal.
Yeah, I would say that we've used this system for a few years now, and we know it pretty well. Like, I know that a 2035 on our marimba needs to be set to -18 at the beginning of the season, and once we switch to good rosewood, -16. Like, we know the drum sets that we're going to be using, we know the tuning scheme we're going to be using, we know the microphones we're going to be using, so we're pretty dialed at this point. So if I was starting from scratch, I would be doing what you're talking about, where I'm going in one at a time. But really what we're looking at is, this is a new ensemble. How do we get to a good starting place? And the crafting thing that you're talking about really has to happen as the brass line gets stronger, because when you're starting at move-ins, they're not playing as in tune as they will, which means they're not quite as loud. And as they get stronger, both visually and musically, we're going to have to do more to support, or we're going to have to do more to get out of the way. And that's the moving part. And as the show changes, obviously we have to make different decisions. It's also getting things set up for FloMarching. A lot of people might not necessarily know that this is funny, and I need to say this for all of my FloMarching homies out there mixing. To the whole world, a lot of times when FloMarching sounds bad on the internet, it's usually the drum corps' fault. And I'm sorry to all my drum corps friends that I'm outing us right now, but we actually send 6 channels to FloMarching, where we're able to separate out soloists, we're able to separate out synths, we're able to separate out samples, so that as those guys receive that, the reason that they do that is so that they can keep a giant sub boom from impacting the compressors whenever the brass is playing a big impact. Gives them a little bit, they're not trying to mix the show, they're trying to sum it together in a way where the brass is going to sound more natural, basically. And so a lot of what we're doing on tour is based on the material that we have and the soloists that we have. It's really coordinating wireless and coordinating shotgun microphones based on what's happening visually.
Kind of like backing up the FloMarching, because totally agree. And I want to like, because they're awesome, and like shout out for the FloMarching homies, is that they definitely do the work during the summer. I mean, they give us a whole spreadsheet for each individual corps that we fill out, that we tell them where we're putting our speakers. We tell them how many speakers we have. We tell them what's coming out of each speaker. We give them the 6 outputs that have electronics and soloists and any other stuff. And they do a lot. And it's definitely a really difficult and very thankless job that they're kind of the heroes. And especially just because they're going up, like, when you're thinking about things like NBA and even like live news stuff, like that's multi-million dollar rigs. Like they have those whole like they have full semis. Like they have a full souped up semi just to do live broadcasting for that stuff. That it's difficult and it's a tough job, and they don't get enough thanks for how difficult that job is and what they're able to pull off.
And to debunk one other thing, if I may, I remember, and FloMarching's come a long way, so this wasn't necessarily the case years ago, but you look at the online forums and you see all this, who is mixing this and who could. The truth is, it's mostly us. It's usually the audio guys from other drum corps that are, when they're not on tour with the drum corps, they're going to other shows. And all of us try and get on to Flo at some point in time so that we can actually see how our stuff's being received on the other end. And Flo does a really good job. Shout out to Eric Cosman. At some of the bigger regionals, he'll record stems and send us back what he got dry so that we have an idea of, oh my gosh, we're sending that trumpet, pre-fader instead of post-fader or whatever it is. So it's very helpful. Those guys do a great job.
Luke, kind of going same question towards you. If you kind of just want to walk us through plans for move-ins and what that kind of looks like for you guys.
In terms of the answer to the question, really similar to what Matthew said. In terms of this season, now this season's a little unique for us because we're in this year after not being on for a year. So we're not necessarily starting from scratch, but we did. We started back in November with our core hall. And it was basically just filled with everyone's stuff, by no fault of anyone's, but that after what had happened the previous year, they took all the cadet corps gear and all the A corps gear and they put it in the core hall, and that's where it lived for a year. So I walked in November, and we've basically spent the last 4 or so months kind of trying to get back to square one, not in a negative way, but just re-inventorying everything, pulling all cables off of everything, testing them, sorting them, almost like we're building from scratch, even though we've used the gear before. But that's basically what our off season looked like. And so now we have, flight cases, kind of like what he said, something about bins. I thought that was funny. We have our flight cases that all the XLR we own, all the power we own, all the Ethercon we own. And basically on Sunday, we put it all back together after being off for that year. So like he said, we'll spend about a week. That's at least the goal of just building. And in a similar situation, we have an agreement with the rest of the staff that there's not going to be sound coming out of speakers for those few days, about 5 or 6 days, and everyone's really cool about that, and they understand that. So we'll be off in our own world. Again, we're staying at a university, so it's really nice that this is a new location for us, so we don't quite know the specifics, but we'll have some kind of isolated space where we get to just kind of dump all of the gear and spend a week just putting it together exactly the way we think it should be, at least for now. So it'll be a week of cabling up the keyboards, rebuilding all of our runs for all the speaker stacks, so power and Ethercon and everything we need to send out. Rebuilding all the synth carts. We were lucky this year in where we're located. We have a great relationship with Titan Field Frames. They're really close by up in North Texas. So we actually picked up all of our frames at the last camp. So we have all those raw carts that we have to put all the stuff on and rig everything up the way we want it. So that's about a week. And then we'll spend another week. Again, this is all in a perfect world, but basically getting out with the core for the first time, getting out with the front ensemble at the beginning, testing all the gain structure, making sure that, every cable's running the way we thought we ran it, which hopefully it will. And then doing all the initial synth build stuff too. So the relationship that we have with, or that I have with Dave Isaacs, he's our sound designer. He is the mastermind behind all the awesomeness and all the sounds. And then I kind of get to be the application person. So he does a lot of stuff on PC and his programs. And then he'll send me all the samples and how they're going to lay out. And then my job is kind of to get that into the main stage and put it across the front ensemble, however we need to do it for it to be executed by the performers. So that'll kind of be the second week. And then, basically the same thing. The rest of the season is, if we've done our job correctly, a lot of it's just kind of learning the show and building the show out, whether that's scenes or whether that's the brass is, getting stronger and the volumes are going up. And so we need to make, small adjustments from there. And then all the visual side of stuff. So all the wireless mics, where are they on the field? We have to make adjustments based on that. Any shotgun type of mics or field mics that we want to use, those being deployed and figuring out how we already kind of have an idea of where they might be, but obviously that might change as the show gets designed. So the goal is that the base work is done so that the rest of the season can kind of be in that design mode. Similar to like the training of the members, they make sure that they sound really, really good. And then the rest of the season is mostly about making the show really good. So that's at least the goal. We'll see if it works out that way, but that's the intention for move-ins at least.
A couple of things popped into my head as Luke was talking. A couple of things that we're also going to do that will be helpful. If you have the ability to do virtual sound checks like I was talking about, that becomes super advantageous because especially when you're doing drum corps and you're on the road, it's such a fight for stadium time. And it's also a godsend to get stadium time with no design or caption head ears around as you experiment. They want things to be right after 2 reps, and they don't understand why it's not right the first time in ensemble. And it's like, I hear you. So getting to do that stuff during meal breaks is huge. One thing that I actually like to do is do a virtual sound check on ensemble mics. I'm saying shotguns. We're not using shotguns. We're going to use VP88s. And so I think condensers work a lot better than your standard shotguns. But doing a virtual sound check of the shotgun microphones is super helpful because you can then go in after the fact and take that into your laptop and run it in post with the recording and figure out where you want extra juice. So the reason that we do that is because we don't want there to be shotgun microphones coming through the speakers right away during move-ins. Because balance-wise, you'll start to chase your tail. There'll be a false sense of confidence from the horn line. And where we stay, the press box is already really close to the field. And so it just gets really confusing. And so ideally in our world, we aren't even really using the shotguns that the staff can hear until week and a half before we go on the road. And from there on our end, we've already heard it in the headphones. We've already heard it during meal breaks with, and we'll A/B it and we'll test it on runs and we'll warn them, hey, we're going to listen to the shotgun microphones this time. But that's a really nice way to keep from chasing your tail a little bit on the road. And back to the inventory thing, as we're talking to people that might want to get into a gig like this, the real reason for the inventory being so important is that stuff breaks on tour. And stuff breaks on tour, Murphy's Law, at the worst times possible. And so when you're at a show and something breaks on the way to the gate, you don't want to be up in the truck. And this happened my first year whenever I was at Cavs. One of the bins had gotten moved. And the microphone clip that I needed was literally buried in cereal. And I'm not kidding. Like boxes of cereal were covering the thing that I needed. And it was an accident. And I'm going to blame the horn line. That's usually my go-to, but just kidding. I love you horn players. But, having a system that is really clear so that if we need to run back and grab something, it is a 5-second job is super important.
Absolutely. I mean, just kind of piggybacking off of that last one is like, it's always impossible to guess what's going to break, but always like as much as possible, I try and have a couple either like small containers or like drawers on carts that go onto the field with us that have as many things that I can guess are going to break, like USB cables or like short microphone cables or things like that, as I try and have those as much as possible so that when things like that happen, I can like hopefully have it right there on the field or, have those things as close as possible. But yeah, that's huge, is having any of those things like XLR cables and 1/4 inches and USB cables, like any of that stuff is huge. I mean, honestly, even like with a lot of groups, I will have a backup MIDI controller that will just be on like a bottom of a cart. That's just like a backup. Even if it's not like an exact replica, it's like good enough to be able to get the important stuff. That it's like, hey, this MIDI controller just went down. It's like, boom, swap in the new one. And it's exactly is just having one of those. So it's like, if you really do get into that place that it's like, you can just swap it out and you have it ready is huge.
This is Carmel's backup 88 key that lives in the bottom of the synth cart.
Nice.
Gonna just tag onto that. One of the things, kind of in the same realm of the off season for us, like one of our biggest investments this year was like storage. And so, working with the transportation manager, like we have an awesome crew that's full time with the Corps. And so I worked with him on how much room do we have in the truck? And, we they were really supportive in terms of, we figured out a flight case system and trying to upgrade all that. Cause again, we had that same issue just 2 years ago, where when you have all these bins and they're all full of copper and you're like by yourself, sweaty, and the show's about to start and you have to move like 15 bins that weigh way too much, it causes all these issues on the road. So really investing in, how is this going to lay out in the truck so that food can still get to their stuff, but we can always be able to access our cases and things like that. So especially helpful in drum corps, but even in the high school realm in terms of how things are stored throughout your setup. Can it be accessed? Do you have backups? Things like that.
I guess another one kind of going into this that for me, honestly, is like a little bit of just like a personal for me to see how other people do this stuff. But I think Matthew is kind of going into some of the stuff you talked about as far as your familiarity with the system. How much would you guys say, even for this upcoming summer, for things like especially like gain staging or EQing or compressing or any type of stuff like that? How much would you say is show specific to what you're going to do for this summer, and how much of it is like essentially, I guess the best word I'll call it is like presets, if hopefully that doesn't come across as like a dirty word, but like, this is our marimba EQ that we've used for the past couple of years. Here's the marimba EQ, and here's this, or on the other side of like, this show is about this, so these are the things I'm going to do with this. Like, how much would you say is a mix of those two types of things?
So for us, again, this season's a little unique in that we're building from scratch, but with like a system we've used before. So we talked as a staff, and we're pretty intentionally, we are starting from scratch in terms of, we want to clear the mixer file. We have old information, but we're going to just kind of try to rebuild, and then we can reference as needed. And part of that's just for kind of the sake of cleaning things out and making sure there's nothing left over that we didn't want before. We also have part of our relationship with Dynasty and Titan and that whole crew. We have a brand new fleet of marimbas that they've kind of been creating over the past few seasons. And we feel like we don't still quite know them. We don't have all those seasons of knowing how they come through the microphones. And again, as everyone would say in the drum corps world, like the kids play amazing. We're biased in terms of like, I think our front ensemble sounds incredible. So a lot of that is making sure that we're getting the read in the microphones that we're getting live, because we know the kids are going to sound awesome. But making sure that the new boards are reading the right way through, like you said, the AT2035s and the mixers. So that's part of the reason why we wanted to start really flat this year, and kind of make decisions from that place, as opposed to starting with something we think was right and then having to make decisions that are maybe fighting each other.
I would say that we don't use presets. That can be a helpful place if you're just getting started, for sure, and to kind of see what other people have done. I know the TF5 has a bunch of presets built in that I think Tom McGillen made. But we're always starting from scratch, just like Luke said, really to avoid gremlins. If you try and piggyback off of last year's mix, then you have to reverse engineer some of it. And I find that just starting from scratch, both with wiring, our front ensemble setup is going to be exactly the same as it was last year, but we're going to start from scratch because now we know everything is starting from new and fresh, instead of hoping that doesn't go wrong over there. In terms of the when you use processing versus when you don't, it's very moment specific. So for example, in terms of the compression that you're talking about, you would compress a soloist very differently in a ballad moment than you would in a trumpet screaming moment. Same instrument, but you're going to process that totally differently. And it also completely has to do with the tessitura that they're playing in. If they're playing something and it needs to have a flugelhorn vibe to it, even though it's not flugel, you're going to treat that completely different than you would something that has like a piccolo trumpet vibe, even if it's on a trumpet. Depending on the range that you're in, the articulation, the style they're playing with, that's going to change a lot. It also depends on the microphone. You're going to use compression to try and account for soloist proximity effect if they're walking up to a microphone. You're going to use a little compression to account for, did they stick their microphone in too far or pull it out too far, just so that there's less room for error there. It's really not for me, it's really not for them dynamically. I'm not trying to crunch their dynamics. I'm just trying to ensure that they have a consistent sound in a performance setting, because when the adrenaline starts going and you're performing in San Antonio and you're in the stadium, they're going to be a little hotter. It just is what it is. You know what I mean? They're going to play a little brighter, or whatever it is. The other thing too is we look at reverbs and reverb times, the pre-delay that you use, and not to get too confusing, but a pre-delay on a reverb is how long it takes for that reverb to kick in. And so a lot of times that's something you want to set based on tempo. If they're playing something very rhythmic or really quickly, you can create serious mud with yourself inadvertently if you don't change some of those settings. So in terms of gates, I don't use gates on anything except for drum set, really. That's so that the toms don't bleed into each other's mics, but we play so delicately that you can't really, that's not the answer for wind. And that's what every band director thinks. The real answer for wind is EQ. You know, you can put a low cut in and get rid of 90% of that stuff. So in terms of the reverb stuff, set it to where it sounds good and take it back 2%. And that's probably where it's supposed to be. Everybody, and I'm talking mostly to the band directors now, instead of, you know, necessarily aspiring audio capture managers or whatever. Everybody thinks dry wet is the answer with reverb, and that's never the answer. The answer is always the length of the reverb, the type of the reverb, and the EQ of the reverb. That's the part that everybody misses. And I would recommend finding just a trumpet solo on YouTube and ripping it off YouTube and playing around with the reverbs that you have in Logic or GarageBand or whatever to see what each one of them does. Understand, what does a hall reverb sound like versus what does a plate sound like versus what does a spring sound like versus what does a convolution reverb sound like? And then playing with the EQ on that reverb and seeing what that sounds like, because that is kind of the secret sauce that people don't really think about. There's, on all these reverbs, there's kind of a low cut and there's a high cut. And we perceive reverb and that distance based on where that high cut moves. So if the high cut is all the way up, it doesn't really sound like reverb to us. It kind of sounds like synth washiness. And that's a cool effect that you might want to use sometimes. You use it on guitars all the time. But when you're trying to make a trombone sound symphonic and natural, if you have that all the way up, you're going to get a lot of airiness and not a lot of richness. But if you have it set too low, that's where it starts to sound tubby and muddy. And so really that's, you hear all that detail that I went into, that completely changes based on what's happening musically. And so to answer your question, the presets are in my mind. I know the gain staging pretty well based on the system that we're using, the speakers that we're using, and the settings that we use on the speakers that we're using, and all that would completely change. You know, I know that the sine sub that I use in main stage works at -18 on our system. Like, if I was on another system, that wouldn't work. So I think that it helps to have muscle memory with your system, but it's always something that's changing, and just having that muscle with your ears when you're in the box to know where to grab the fader is really helpful. And I think that just comes from experience.
That was great. So many awesome nuggets of information that were just packed into like those last 3 minutes of what you said.
Once I get going, I don't stop, man. You got to just cut me off.
No, dude, I love it. It was great. There's so many things I wanted to like piggyback on and jump off of. I guess the reverb one for sure was huge, and fully agree on all of that. That is huge, that there's so much more than the wet and the dry. That's kind of definitely the go-to is the wet and the dry, but like the EQ for sure is a big one. I've even like the pre-delay or the pre-delay kind of stuff is even huge for clarity. That I kind of learned that one this past summer too, that the pre-delay can also help almost as like a compressor on the reverb. Is that a pre-delay, if you have it super short, then it immediately makes everything really washy, and you get a little bit of pre-delay, then it kind of helps give some clarity before the reverb kicks in.
I actually learned that from a string tutorial. There's a guy that I follow that does a lot of mixing orchestral music tutorials, and he was using it on 16th note staccato strings. And he was talking about if you set that pre-delay too far, you're actually making the strings dirty with themselves. And I was like, oh my God, that's marimba. I've been making my marimba lines dirty for all this time because I've just been setting it to 37 because I didn't know what to do. That sort of thing. That's where I learned it. So
Yeah, I guess kind of going back to the building the setup, because the other one is that was kind of cool. Is like all of us were kind of saying a similar thing, and I think I honestly kind of agree with it. And for me at Blue Knights, we're kind of forced into the doing the clean start every season because we have an indoor group that also use the exact same equipment. So every summer it ends, and then the indoor group does their thing, which is a completely separate team because it's all basically Denver locals because it's an indoor group. And then we switch over to drum corps and essentially starting from scratch again, which was great. And that's basically what I was doing a few weeks ago at the April camp, was like, resetting everything back, is taking all the cables off, taking all these things off, which I think is great, especially because it's a once a year thing. And so starting from scratch really gets me to rethink everything that I did in the best way possible with my like 1 year smarter brain. Is like I can go back and restart instead of just like doing the thing that it was last year and just kind of band-aiding from there. It's like getting to just have a fresh start every year, being 1 year smarter and having one more year of experience to be able to readdress all the things and rethink certain things and be like, maybe I want to do it this way this year. And, that way kind of ran into that problem. So I can restart with this year, and just being able to start from scratch can really help upgrade systems every year in such a big way that I think can be really huge. So then I guess after move-ins, kind of the other big one that I guess kind of like a 2-1 that I will start with, just like the audio team. How does the audio team function on tour? And how you guys handle those kinds of things. I know, Matthew, you kind of already touched on having like the A1 and the A2 and the upstairs and the downstairs. That I think is big. I know for us at Blue Knights, that's a major one, especially for this summer too, is always having at least 2 people that are purely audio focused all season long. Is there's always going to be 2 people there, because that is huge. And that was, we definitely, kind of just being honest on all of this, is there were points last summer where it was just one person, and that one person was me. And I definitely learned that the hard way, that it was like, getting pulled on both sides, where I was down on the field and was like, I need to like fix this thing and I need to plug this thing in. And then also at the same time was like getting buzzed by the music coordinator or whoever, like, dude, you need to be in the box right now. Like, this balance is all messed up. We need you in the box right now. And I was like, okay, I'll be there in like 20 minutes. I just have to do this thing. And it's like, definitely was like way too many things that needed to be done for like a 1-person job. That being able to have those 2 people is huge throughout the entire summer, especially for those like the percussion ensemble and full ensemble times, like any time that it's everybody, being able to have that person up in the box that's doing that sort of like balancing and big picture things, and also having the person on the field that's handling all the on the field things, making sure everything's working and they're getting all that stuff functioning and everything's set up the way that it needs to be. I think is big. I would say that for sure is sort of like the main baseline that I would always be aiming for a summer, is to always have at least those 2 roles the entire time. But I guess I'm just curious for you guys, maybe outside of that, or just sort of like general philosophies of how the audio team functions throughout the summer.
Yeah, same thing that you guys both said about, our attempt is to have 2 people on the road at all times. Mostly because of what you just mentioned in terms of having those 2 sets of hands. One can be kind of a boots on the ground person, and one can be in that big picture role. But also just, logistics of bunking and buses. And we can't really have more than 2 people on the road just because we're trying to move this show down across the country. So we have that exact same system. We've mapped out our stints based on the timing that people are in. So, in terms of who's going to be down at the mixer, we've kind of made those decisions as a team based on, if this person's about to be in for a stint that's going to involve 10 shows, it makes more sense for them to stay on that mixer the entire time and do that role. And then we'll send the other person up to the box because they're only going to be in for the weekend. We'll give, a set of fresh ears. They'll be working with the staff up there, the other music coordinators, to call information down and kind of coordinate the big picture side of things. So that's how we map out the, kind of those two roles of at least during an ensemble rehearsal, who's at the mixer and who's up. Obviously, day to day, it's, all hands on deck. If we have an afternoon project and some cable got ripped out of a connection because, that happens, we're going to fix it and stuff like that. In terms of the flow, throughout the season of those roles, similar to what you just said, we had a long conversation, one as like an audio team a week or so ago. And then I've had a conversation with both our brass team as well as the percussion team, just kind of getting everyone on the same page of the things that we can accomplish and the things that we can't, and kind of just making sure all the philosophies are the same. I think on the road, that can be one of the biggest stress points for the audio staff, is that, again, we're being pulled in a lot of different directions, all, by well-mannered people. But sometimes we can be getting, sometimes it feels like we don't know who our boss is, or we don't know if we can, if they told us to change this, I don't really know if I should. And again, and no fault of anyone's, but just everyone's trying to make the show better. But it's easy to get pulled in all those directions. So, one of the things getting ahead of this season was making sure everyone's on the same page about, how the adjustment process, once we're set up and we are in ensemble, how the process is going to go. We have a spreadsheet that we've already kind of started working on. The goal, at least, is that every time there's a major change that happens in ensemble, we brought the trumpet soloist down -5. We have to document it on that spreadsheet, which is a huge hassle during the season, but it allows us to kind of always, in a good way, second guess those decisions. Like, okay, are we about to make this change? Are we really going to bring all the marimbas down on the DCA? Like, that's a pretty big deal. Are we all sure that that's good? And it's not just, the humidity's higher that night and we're in this terrible high school stadium and suddenly everything's too loud, bring it all down. And then the next show's a nightmare because you're trying to undo all these things you did at the last ensemble. So in terms of the season flow and making those adjustments, that's just something that we've spent a lot of time kind of thinking about and working with. And we're, as everyone is, we're super lucky to work with these amazing brass coordinators and all sorts of stuff. And so they've been super understanding and just getting on the same page of, even in terms of deploying and using, like you said, the field mics. What is the purpose of those? Why are we going to use them? When are we going to use them? What can they do? What can they not do? And if you ask us to do it, we won't be able to. Or if we try to use them for that purpose, it's going to cause all these other issues that, in the moment in that ensemble on the road, you might not think about. But then you get 3 shows down, you go, oh my goodness, we destroyed everything. And that's caused all this feedback at the past 3 shows. And we didn't even think about it because in the moment it was just, make this change because it band-aided things. So that's just something we've got ahead of this season that I think, we'll find out once the season gets started, but I'm hoping it causes a lot of positivity in terms of repercussions down the road, just getting everyone on the same page of the philosophies that we're operating by and things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you definitely brought up a really big point that I think is important for like any ensemble, is making sure that there's a clear established like chain of command or hierarchy. I think is really important. That just making sure, I think for any, like for the staff as a whole, is super important, and just making sure that the audio is included in that. Like who is the people that should be having those conversations with the audio person, just so that it's not like everybody comes at the audio person with all of their opinions and thoughts and does all the things, but it's like who has the conversations with the audio people, who is the ones that, have those types of discussions. And I mean, I guess also is just like a thing that I'll put out there for anyone that also ends up listening to this, is also like empowering the audio people. I mean, for me at Blue Knights, I have full autonomy of the audio caption, and there's conversations and discussions, but at the end of the day, it is the audio caption head that has full autonomy of what happens and what gets implemented. That also just having that trust in your audio team, the same way it would be for anything else. I mean, the same stuff that would sound absurd of like a trumpet tech going over and talking to the bass tech about changes that need to be made to the bass drums. It's like, no, that wouldn't happen. You talk to your caption heads, and then the caption heads have a discussion, and then the percussion caption head makes the call on what's going to happen. Like, it's having that type of hierarchy that just helps create a healthy environment for everybody, so that people don't end up with frustration and whatever, and audio people don't feel like they're getting attacked by everybody, but there's a chain of command so that everyone knows, like, here's how the discussions happen. If it does feel like there's something that needs to happen, these are the conversations, and this is how we get to that place of how those things happen. Because I think that's important, is doing stuff like that. And like some of the stuff we've talked about is like setting up expectations of how the audio stuff is gonna go all season, and just so everyone's clear on that side, especially like on the brass side, is all the brass people are understand things like you're talking about, like with the field mics and that sort of implementation, and maybe wireless brass mics, if there's, if wireless brass mics are a thing throughout the show, and like just making sure all those expectations are clear as much as possible, just to keep everyone like in the loop and everyone happy.
I would say that to all of that, a big thing is having the trust of your higher ups and establishing who is responsible for the balance hierarchies, and also knowing when the battery consultant ensemble guy comes in, he's going to want to hear more battery. And when the front ensemble consultant guy comes in, he's going to want to hear more front ensemble. And when the Texas band director comes in that has incredible ears, the percussion's all going to be too loud. Sorry, Texas. I'm sorry. I take it back. And they're always right. So, I'm not even making fun of them right now. But I'm really fortunate that I'm at a place where I have implicit trust from the people that I'm working with. It helps that I've worked with them for so long. There's definitely that ebb and flow of getting to know the people. Let's be honest, there's a low barrier for entry in our field because it's so new, and the people that really know how to do it are younger folks. And so if I'm Matt Harloff and I've been in front of horn lines my entire life, and now I have to hand over balance control to a 22-year-old or, whatever, a 32-year-old even, that's a really scary and anxiety-inducing place to be. And so when they come to you with, a tone that might not be the nicest, and it feels a little panicked and urgent, it's because they don't know how to fix it. They have control of everything else in the whole world, and you're the one variable that they don't have control over, and they can only rely on what you've told them. And they've been lied to by uneducated people 50 times before you stood right in front of them. And then the electronics have failed at this big show and this big show and this big show and this big show in their past. And so I always take all of that in whenever I go to talk to somebody, and it feels like the pressure's high. And I'm always just trying to talk them off the ledge a little bit, and just telling them what's possible and what's not with what our current setup is. And if they want to do this, this is how much it's going to cost you. And is that going to come out of the designer budget, or is that going to come out of because I don't have any budget left. So we're going to have to find the money from somewhere to make that happen. So for instance, before we went on tour last summer, we wanted to do something with the soloist, but our props were made out of metal and they were going to be on the back corner. And so I'm letting them know, with the system that we currently have, the antennas that we currently have, it's going to work every single show until we get to San Antonio. And as soon as we get to San Antonio, I promise you it's not going to work, because they have all of those POS systems and all those concession stands that you're not used to having. Yes, there's all the bodies out there, but really what you're dealing with in those situations is you're in downtown areas. Indianapolis is a perfect example. There's a government building across the street that eats the entire H band. What are you going to do about that? Those are the things that you try and have those educated conversations, and you learn that stuff as you do these shows. For BOA, I don't use wireless if I can possibly avoid it, because it's at a time where there could be a cold scan the next day. And if there is, they load in the day before, and they're already eating frequencies. And so, those little tricks, when you show the higher ups that peek behind the curtain, they start to trust you, because they see okay, he's not just telling me what he doesn't want to do, he's actually educating me. And I think that's the piece that everybody misses, is you're not telling them, no, we can't do that. You're saying, okay, if you want to do that, here's what we need to make that happen. Here's what we have currently, and here's what we can accomplish with what we currently have. I can't possibly turn the bass drums down in these field mics. That is not something I have control with. So you can turn them down to mezzo forte, and then I can turn these microphones up and get the brass that you want. but it's going to feel awkward to the bass drums, and you're going to have to relay that message to them because I'm just the sound guy in front of the mixer, but I can't get them out of the mics, or I'm getting the tubas out too. Those sorts of conversations, hopefully you've got someone around you that can be helpful there. I think the problem that we really run into is whenever they want it to be louder, 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 louder. And that's where you have to tell them, like, listen, amplified bad sounds are louder bad sounds. And, at drum corps, we don't have to have those conversations quite as much, but it does get to the point where we get competitive and the loudness war is totally a thing. I mean, let's be honest. Everyone's trying to be as loud as they can at the end. And, it's a thing that we're up against for sure. So
yes, that loudness war is 100% real. Being totally real, comes from multiple different places. It's not just your brass staff telling you. There's a lot of pressure from a lot of places to be loud and to go out there and be like, melt your face off loud.
This might be a good time to mention the wireless thing that's happening at some of the drum corps. Luke, are you guys using wireless on a bunch of players or just soloists?
Currently, we're not planning on using the 32 channels or anything. We set ourselves up in terms of like planning on purchases this year. Like I'll tell you right now, we have 16 channels available of ULX that we made sure, like, let's have this on our truck. We are starting with the perspective of that's starting with soloists only. And then, we're kind of slowly dipping into if there's times where we need support, especially support from a place of clarity, not necessarily from a place of volume, but sometimes visually how things are staged on the field, distance causes loss of volume. And so, deploying what we'll call ensemble wireless mics, where it's not necessarily a soloist player, but we're trying to get players within that ensemble on certain parts to read better. We've talked about having that option, and it's kind of something where that's part of the, we get past that first build out week, and as we learn the show, we're giving ourselves those options. But yeah, I think that's a really good point, because I know some folks, and you'll dive into it more, but what things do things well. Sometimes the field mics, we think they do something, but they don't. And then, sometimes we need the wireless mics to do things that it would work better. Anyways, I'm rambling a little bit, but so yes and no, but I kind of know what you're getting at there.
What I'm really getting at is there's a giant misconception right now that we're starting to see horn lines get mic'd, 28 to 32 channels on brass players. And I'm in a drum corps that does not mic wirelessly. And it was presented as a philosophical decision. And that sounds very patriarchal. It's more so Rich Saucedo's sound of his writing works really, really well in the dome. And that's kind of his sound. His sound is kind of the dome. And so philosophically, it's more our sound works better with that. Bluecoats are kind of the pioneers that got out and started doing it first. And when you look at what their source material is, they're doing a lot of source material that is chamberworks or fusion or small ensemble stuff. That stuff sounds terrible in Lucas Oil. It sounds really bad. And so really when you see these mic horn lines, what people are trying to do is beat the reverb of Lucas Oil to the box and to the audience. And the truth is, a lot of groups you'll see running the wireless horn line and field microphones. And the truth is, when you turn all the wireless up in a big hit moment, it sounds horrible. A lot of people are actually turning the wireless mics off in the big hits, and they're turning the field mics on. And to all the old fogies, yes, I called you that have something to say about field mics. The truth is, we have asked the brass to play so loud for so long. And a lot of the people that complain about it are people that had to go through it themselves. But when we switched front ensembles to using mics and amplifying the front ensembles, we stopped hurting the kids' hands. We stopped giving them tendonitis. They now had this incredible range of dynamics they didn't have access to before. We used to lose everything that was below a mezzo forte, and now we get to hear the instrument just open up. And really, that's the goal of the field mics. It's not to be louder than the drum corps next to us. At times, yeah, we're trying to be stronger, but really it allows the kids to play with a more concert sound at that triple forte. Yeah, they're still playing triple forte, but they're not just blowing as hard as they can because we want them to be louder. They're playing with a good, strong, fundamental concert sound that we can then blend into the mix. Because the other thing to consider too is if you have only acoustic sound happening on the field and only synthetic sound happening from the front ensemble, the mix reverb is never going to sound right. And so if you have a little bit from the field that is also coming through that amplification system, it sounds much more natural, actually. And you hear people do it poorly. You know, you hear people do it synthetically, and that's just it being done poorly. It's not that all systems sound fake. It can be done well or it can be done poorly, like anything else. And so I just wanted to debunk that and help people understand kind of why that's being done. It's an expense that is high, but most of the drum corps are renting, either renting to go on tour with the wireless. So it's a much smaller expense than you would think, in the range of $15,000 to $20,000, which in the grand scheme of a $3-4 million drum corps budget, it fundamentally changes the sound a lot. The cost of two tubas, when you think of it in those terms, fundamentally changes the sound of the drum corps completely in those chamber moments like you would want to. So as I look at that versus like what a high school could spend, a lot of the drum corps, if they did buy the wireless themselves, are then backlining it in the off season. And in truth, they might actually be making money off their wireless. It might actually be a fundraiser for them. And so philosophically, as you're watching from the outside, and you're like, oh my God, these drum corps are spending $350,000. It's like, okay. And you know, I'm in a drum corps where we have not invested as heavily as some others. And so I feel like I can, from my angle, say all of this in good faith and say, you know, I don't judge the Bluecoats for the amount that they've invested, because that's part of their design color that they've chosen, and that's their unfair advantage. They're really, really good at that. I had a conversation with Richard Saucedo 3 nights ago, about Blue Devils. He works at Blue Devils, and he was talking about seeing a microphone on a snare drum. And so the obvious old band director guy question is like, are they miking a single snare drum and playing that through so it sounds really clean? It's like, no, they're using that for an in-ear monitor for the drum set player so that they can count off on a cold attack in the back. And yes, we have gotten that advanced. Yes. And so it's like, oh my God. It's like, yeah, dude, we're doing some kind of crazy stuff to make things happen on the field. And one of the best at that is just a shout out to Ryan Kilgore at the Bluecoats. He is a timing genius. And it's fun to watch as we start to develop in the audio world, and we're all friends with each other and stealing each other's ideas like we're talking about tonight. That's one of my most recent ones where I've watched guys use monitors and ears in creative ways to fix timing issues on the field. So,
okay, as always, because you say a lot of stuff and it's all awesome. with the wireless, totally. And I guess to me that would also be to like, hopefully towards like band directors and audio types, is doing wireless brass on each person in an ensemble thing is like a balance nightmare. And I have also learned that firsthand. It is you're now like removing all of that acoustic balance that the brass caption head is working on hours a day, because now you've completely changed the balance through the speakers with the balance and the gain and all that stuff. Like that stuff is a nightmare. Doing like field mics in ensemble and area mics like that has always been way easier and works way better, because it allows them to keep doing that acoustic balance that they use their ears for. Because as soon as you do wireless, their ears are now essentially useless, because now there's something happening out front that they can't hear and they can't react to that. You've removed that from them, and it just makes everything crazy. So that's kind of out there too for all the people, and knowing that the people that are doing the wireless stuff in the best way know how to handle those things and are being really smart with those things and know the answers to those types of situations. That is huge. And it's definitely like repertoire based and knowing what kind of stuff you're playing. I know for sure, like at Blue Knights, to what you're talking about, and to kind of also give like an inside of the conversations that we have for anyone that watches and listens to the audio stuff. A lot of stuff, like especially last summer when we would choose to use wireless or field mic kind of stuff, a lot of it was not necessarily about volume, but it's understanding that, it's things like every band director knows, but just kind of helping them understand too that like instruments sound different at different volumes. The timbre of the instrument changes at different volumes. So you could do it acoustically, but that means that you're going to get a certain timbre out of the instrument. And that's things we talked about at Blue Knights, that the brass caption head, he was fully aware of that. And we would talk about that kind of stuff. And he'd be like, yeah, we could hear them and I could just have them play loud, but this is supposed to be like a mezzo piano solo. And it's not going to come across as a delicate mezzo piano solo acoustically. They're just going to have to play loud. And so now we don't have that type of color choice. So then we could put a wireless mic on it, so then it can have that type of color. It can be a mezzo piano intimate solo that they don't just have to blast and be heard, which is the same thing that we learned with mallet instruments and all that stuff, is we got to finally move away from the ice cream truck, super loud, clanky mallets and move into all different types of colors because we had microphones. And it's like just the same kind of thing that's happening in the brass world, is we're able to open up a whole color palette that was not available to us before because you just had to play loud to be heard. That I think is a big one. And those are absolutely the conversations that happen during the summer on the audio side, is like, we're doing these things to get these types of acoustic colors and to do these kinds of things with that sound, and not necessarily like just make it louder. Like it just needs to be loud. That is like almost never the conversation when we're doing those kinds of things.
And one other thing that this ties to also is the rumor that we are playing brass patches on the synths. That's another situation that is actually harder than not doing it. If you think that I'm good enough to map every articulation and note length, that's the thing people don't think through, is like, if you've ever programmed a film score, the learning curve is so incredibly hard. There's a reason why everybody's Sibelius stuff still sounds like 1998. And it's because you have to actually go in and on every instrument, program every articulation and every note release for every dynamic. And so there's a lot of those rumors out there that I try and debunk anytime I can. And I brought up Richard Saucedo earlier. He is such an inspiration to me as a lifelong learner. And so he brings that stuff to me, not with a like, how dare they? It's more of a like, I saw this and it can't be what I thought. Tell me what I'm seeing. And it's like every time I hang out with him, he's smarter. It drives me nuts because he'll mention something. It's like, how do you know that? Like, how do you, it's really cool. So,
yeah. And I mean, just to like jump on that too, because I mean, at Blue Knights, we did that same thing this last summer with a mic on a snare drum. And it's absolutely not a cheat code. It is a whole new can of worms to make sure that you have to then be working on input delays, because if the input delay is wrong, that in-ear monitor is now useless, because now what the drum set player is getting in their ear is not in time anymore. It's wrong. And so they could be playing with what's in their ear, and ensemble timing is still a disaster. That it's definitely not a cheat code. It's just a whole new way of approaching things that takes a lot of work and is not a simple, like, I would not suggest any type of random high school to start doing that as a cheat code. Like, it opens up a whole new can of worms to do in-ear monitors with a mic on a snare drum feeding to a drum set or a timpani or whoever you have in the front ensemble. That it's cool, but it takes a lot of work.
Last bit is not to mention in-ears completely change the sound for the performer, and their instrument sounds wrong. And so that's another thing to take into consideration too. Go ahead, Luke.
As folks, for more the band director type audience, or people maybe starting off with this, as people see those mics deployed, again, some groups using up to 32 channels potentially out there, the input delay thing is massive too. Like if we were to run those mics hot the entire show, you got to consider, that mellophone plays their note and that note starts traveling to the audience. But if there's a mic on it and it hits that mic and that's live, it comes out of the speaker immediately. So programming that alone, if someone's out there doing it with the whole group, shout out to them. But it would be, nearly impossible to map that constantly changing location of every single instrument. So that's, again, one of the conversations that we had as a full kind of with the brass staff and everyone is talking about that. I think that's so important is, hey, if we, anytime we do want to deploy these mics, we have to consider the timing. If they're running across the field front to back, it's going to be really hard to get that acoustic sound to line up with the amplified sound. And again, like you said, using those mics for clarity, I think that was one of the biggest like light bulb moments. Because again, I'm talking to Evan Van Dorn. He's brilliant. One of the best wind arrangers out there. And just talking through, like, if we're going to use field mics, we're going to do it for volume. And if we're going to use the wireless, it's for clarity or for timbre and stuff like that. And again, all these wind people know that stuff, but just kind of being able to translate that through our lens of audio, it's just super helpful because everyone gets on the same page. Because it's not, crazy information. I don't think any of us here have like a PhD in acoustics or anything like that, but it's stuff that we do every day with our students. Oh, well, there you go. My apologies, doctor. But we do it every day with our students, and sometimes we just forget those principles when we're out there playing with all the gear and things like that. Same thing with the dynamics. We talked about that earlier. This was something we talked through as an audio staff. Like, we're going to be asked to make the, front ensemble potentially quieter before we touch the faders. Can they play any quieter in that moment? They can. Let's do it. Like, and sometimes, but no one means, again, there's no harm trying to be meant. But we just forget that because the fader's there and you're like, I turn it down, they got quieter, easy fix, versus forgetting that we're teaching a musical product. So anyways, that was just the stuff I want to make sure I got out there for the band director audience.
James, I do want to drop one more thing into the band director audience. I am avidly against wireless performers at the high school level in 90% of the circumstances, because I think it takes away from you just being a band director. One consideration to make is you see, oh my gosh, there's 3 audio people down there. The comparison that I would make is, do you have 4 snare techs for your high school? Okay, then you probably are not making a fair comparison in terms of the responsibility of the audio people that are on tour at a drum corps, because there are, there's 4 bass drum techs throughout the summer. As you look at an audio staff and we're coming in and we're coming out, you can't be expected as a band director to try and manage all of that yourself. And your money probably is much better spent hiring staff members to teach your kids instead. You're going to get way more bang for your buck if your kids sound better acoustically. Now, there are scenarios, like there's a band, I can't remember the name. I want to say they're from Dayton, and it's a Catholic school and it's a private school. And they amplify all their kids and they sound insane. But they've only got like 14 wind players in the band. And so they create this blast type production and it works really well for them. But I can't imagine the work that goes into that. And when we judge, I think a lot of the older band director guys that are against this have judged, and they've seen bands that are smaller try and overcompensate with wireless, and then it just sounds horrible. And so that's why I'm against it. If you're a big enough program that you can afford to make that go, and you can afford somebody that's there full time to run the audio and actually understands it, then okay. And to that end, people don't realize how much we're actually mixing the on-field microphones. There is a lot that goes into mixing on-field microphones. They're not just sitting on the whole show. They're happening very calculated based on what's happening on the field, and there's somebody doing this the entire show. It's not as simple as change scene, because we have to react to the drill that's happening in front of them. So if you're a band director guy out there and you're listening to this and you're trying to think, I'm going to get field microphones and make my band louder, there's a way more that goes into it than you would think. And as you get negative feedback from other people saying you shouldn't use these, that's really what they mean. What they mean is it makes your band sound synthetic and not natural if you don't know what you're doing. So I
just wanted to shout out that I think the high school you're talking about, Archbishop Alter in Ohio, It was like 2 years ago. It was like a Stevie Wonder show, and yeah, there's like 14 students, and it was such a perfect representation of like when that is extremely well done. And obviously, it was an investment by the school. Like they're like, we're going to put on this production with this smaller program, but it was great, and it wouldn't have read the same if they didn't use those mics, just because of the amount of students they had out there. So anyway, shout out to whoever's over there at Archbishop Alter.
Yeah, awesome show. One of my favorites that year.
And I guess like part of that kind of leads me into the next thought. And I think especially I see this most at the high school level, that is trying to make sure that the audio stuff is incorporated as early and as strongly as any other element of the show, that I think isn't even necessarily like a some sort of resource intensive thing. It's just making sure that as conversations start for your next season, January, February, like I don't think there's ever a point where it's too early to make sure that there is an audio uh, thinking person, an audio educated person in the discussions for that type of stuff. Just because I think that's where a lot of the like mistakes come into, or a lot of like some of the issues come in, is when for like us that have a lot more of this knowledge, I think it's probably more obvious to us when the audio stuff has very obviously been band-aided on as an afterthought rather than incorporated into what they're doing. That I think is just important to make sure that you have an audio person involved as early as possible, to have some of those things, kind of like Matthew, you were talking about a little while ago, to be able to have those kinds of things like, hey, if you want to do this, like this is what you need and this is how it needs to be set up. Or like, if you want to do that, like if you want to have field mics, you need to make sure these things are happening, or like the drill is put together this way, or we have these moments designed in a certain way that helps those things be as beneficial as possible, so that it doesn't end up where, like, I've definitely been in those situations where I get asked to consult or just give feedback or kind of help out a high school program in October or November or whenever, as they're kind of getting later in the season. And it's like, hey, these kinds of things are creating issues that at this point is not fixable, because the answer to it is to completely rewrite the drill to make this work. And it's like, and obviously that's not feasible right now in October. Like it would have been feasible in like March, but in October right now it's not feasible. That this needed to be like this thing way back then. That I think that stuff's important. That I think at this point most drum corps have now understood that and figured that out, that the audio person should be involved from the very beginning, and there should be someone there to help give those types of feedback as the pieces of everything are being put together. But I think that's definitely just an important one for all programs to be thinking about. Is it's never too early to have an audio person involved in the conversation and make sure they are aware of all the stuff, so that all those things can get incorporated in the best way possible and everything can work. Because I know that, I mean, I was at Arcadia for like 8 fall seasons. I think I did 8 marching band seasons with them. And we definitely, like, to for sure the credit of Kevin Shaw and Kevin Sherrill, were always really smart with the incorporation of field mics. We started using those the last few years that I was there. And it was definitely really smart the way that it was put together. And there was always like intention behind, like, this moment is going to happen. This section is going to come to this spot of the field. We have a field mic right there. It turns on right here. They play and then they leave and it turns off. Like it was always like, from all parts of it was cohesive and made sense, from the wind and musical arranging to the drill design to the placement of the field mics. Like all of it was thought out and put together from the beginning and was planned out for the most amount of success. And that's like probably some of the most successful field miking I've been a part of from a high school in Southern California. Was like very well thought out and very intentional and benefited them in a really big way.
I think that there's a couple nuggets in there that would be helpful for band director types. Kiss of death is you bring the audio guy in 3 days before the BOA regional. You think you're doing yourself a help because you're going to sprinkle on that extra 10%. You just ruin the balances for your entire show. So my recommendation is if you're going to bring out the Audio Pro, bring them out 3 times. Bring them out in the beginning of the summer, bring them out in that August band camp, and then bring them in your fall camp in September after you've been to a couple of shows. And then, send them recordings, see what they think. That's number one. And to your end, what you talked about with the field mics, I've had enough meetings and design meetings with Mason Daphne, our incredible drill writer at the Cavaliers. I could almost figure out what the mix is going to be of the field mics without even needing to be there live. Like I know exactly what section is where. I've gone through with a video and annotated the video of what the mics need to do in the specific moments, where the soloists are at on the field. I've already pre-calculated the delays of all of those soloists. Like that's the stuff band directors don't realize that we're doing on the back end that really make a huge difference. And those are the things that you should pay somebody else to take care of for you. And that is really helpful. So,
yeah. And I would say the other one to that too, that I think is a sentiment that I'm sure a lot of band directors have heard all the time, but I think is one that's always worth saying that applies to audio as much as it does anything else, is just making the right decisions for your group. That I know, I mean, Matthew already kind of touched on it a little bit, but if you are going to do audio stuff, you need an audio person that's at rehearsals at least like semi-regularly to make sure all that stuff's working, and just making sure that if like you want to do that stuff, your group has the ability to put those resources out. And otherwise just being smart with those decisions, that maybe it's like, maybe that's not something we should try and do because we don't have the resources to implement it effectively. And so it's better to just go in a different direction than to try and, do like a half measure, and then just no one benefits in those situations. It's just being smart with what the resources your program has and what you're able to do and what you're able to achieve. But that is definitely like, there's the same way that, it feels like it's a no-brainer for anything else. Like you would not put a battery on the field without someone to teach your battery kids. It's like that feels like a no-brainer. You're not going to put a battery on the field without a battery staff. It's like you should not put audio and electronics out without some type of audio electronic staff that can handle those types of things. It's just like making sure that stuff is applied for everyone, for everyone's benefit. Cool. Yeah, I mean, I guess the other ones that I got, I mean, maybe if you guys have any other, maybe like thoughts or tips or, like little nuggets of information you've learned from throughout drum corps stuff. Or if you guys also want to give any type of insight or shout outs to any types of things for people to be on the lookout for during the summer, of maybe specific philosophies that you guys are going to be doing, or maybe any sort of cool audio things that you think would be cool for people to pay attention to.
Just thinking of things to cover from the perspective of someone watching, whether you're in the drum corps world or not. I think the conversation you were just having, I think is really important just from someone. I'm a band director. I'm a percussion director, but my title with my district is I'm an assistant band director. I'm just lucky out here in North Texas to get to focus on percussion. But even myself being, someone who really enjoys the audio stuff, I could catch myself, especially like the first year or two that I was here, of trying to do both jobs at once. And it's just unnecessarily stressful, and it's a diminishing return. And I think we have enough on our plates sometimes as teachers and band directors already that we can accidentally add more to our plate and make our life, less enjoyable, and rehearsals less enjoyable because of it. So one of the things I've done here that helped so much this season was I was really specific about when I was the percussion director and when I was the audio person. And most of the time I was the percussion director, but I set aside, there was once a week that I'll go up on the roof, which is our vantage point here. And I make sure that I have some staff in that day to work with the kids, so they're not being, ignored. But I am only doing audio that day. And then I leave that, and I leave all the audio behind, and whatever it sounds like, it sounds like. But I'm not constantly trying to, the French horn's too loud, but the snares are dirty, and it causes unnecessary stress. So that was one thing that helped me a ton. And then another tip that I had was actually stolen from, I don't want to mess up his name. I think it was John Brennan, who's around here, who's like super legend in this area. But he gave it at a sound check clinic that summer, which is a thing that some of the guys around here in Texas and some other areas are doing. I think Ruben's involved with that as well. But they did video run throughs. So they record their run through and then they make all their mix notes on that. And then that was it. So they weren't live mixing at all. They'd record the run through, and then the next day he'd sit down in the office. Okay, French horn needs to come down, and you need to know, what you're doing. French horn comes down -3. This bass drop was too loud. This sample was too loud, and then he makes those adjustments, and that's all he does. And then he goes back to teaching. So just like really separating those roles. I know it's not really specific to the drum corps thing, but that helped me so much this year in terms of being someone who is trying to do both jobs of the audio thing and the percussion thing, or the audio thing and the band thing. Is figuring out ways to still do them well, but really separate them so you're not constantly pulled in two directions, which again is something we're super fortunate as audio people in the summer. Like I get to just focus on audio. It's really fun. I still get to enjoy watching the incredible teachers and performers, but I get to kind of, micro focus. In terms of things to look out for, I can't promise anything super crazy this year, at least not yet. I can tell you one kind of philosophical thing that we talk about a lot with Dave Isaacs, our sound designer, and Paul and Sandy Rennick, is they're a huge fan of the electronics being still very a part of the acoustic performance. So like the past few years, we've had all these DTXs. 2 years ago, we ran 6 DTXs across the back, or maybe not 6, might have been 5. I can't remember. But that's simply because we wanted to see the sound design being performed as a part of the product. We could have just, put it on a patch. And not that there's anything wrong with that, but they were just really big philosophically to wanting to see that and integrate the electronics into the acoustic as much as possible. So that's something I'm looking at a pile over here on my desk. I don't think I can quite share. And none of we don't have a plan yet, but there's just a few things we're going to experiment with that are, ways we can integrate the sound design into the acoustic performance as much as possible. Just to kind of keep it feeling as natural and feeling as unique in that sense as possible. And, we'll still have moments that we hit the sample and it runs. Like, obviously, that's just part of the game in terms of only having a few sets of hands. But that is something that I think we're going to try to do. We don't have exactly how we're going to do it yet, but just something that we're always aiming for.
Beneath the Armor is the running show title. And essentially what that represents is the ability to let the armor go and be vulnerable. And we're an all-male drum corps, and so there's that masculine element there of feeling like you need to be macho and that you can't be your true self to the outside world. And basically what I'm doing, I'll talk a little bit about the sound designer side. Ludwig, who did Black Panther, he just did, what's the crazy movie he just did? He did Creed 2, Oppenheimer, he just did. He talked about Oppenheimer throughout the film score was represented by a solo violin. And as you heard that violin line change character throughout the film, that was him changing throughout the film. And that really resonated with me. And so as you listen to the sound design throughout the Cavaliers show, I've done that kind of in 2 places. One, with male vocals, will transform from kind of being synthetic, almost vocoder, but not in a way that is like T-Pain style auto-tuned. It'll be a color that works well and isn't kind of what's been done before. And that will transfer, that will metamorphosis into a really authentic Josh Groban style singer in the closer. And I've also done the same with guitar. So in the opener, you're going to hear a really clean mint guitar. And then by the end, you're going to have something that's a little crunchier and more power chords in the back. So I'm kind of taking that idea, and on the sound design thing, I'm trying to follow that. And I love finding layers. As I'm thinking about the Nola Jones that are adjudicating, I want to put as many of those little Pixar Easter eggs that can be picked up on, that even if they're felt and not heard, are there and help you feel the transition throughout the show. In terms of crazy audio stuff that we're doing, the truth is I am careful to do that stuff. And I think I'm more risk averse than others just because I'm band director guy, and I've been the guy throwing up and crying behind a semi truck because the sound didn't work at the super regional. For me, I try and run as simple a system as I possibly can. And so you're going to see the Cavaliers roll out with less equipment than a lot of other drum corps, but we're not wirelessly miking the horn line. As we're talking about number of staff members that need to be on the road, I think that you need to have two. And as you're trying to talk to the higher ups, the administration on why that's necessary, you need somebody at the gate that can push the equipment on the field and someone else that can run back to the truck whenever the power cable gets ripped in half. You need someone that's down on bottom and somebody that's up top. I think if you're running a wireless horn line, you need three people on the road. You need somebody that can be the wireless person that is living in wireless workbench. And to that end, whenever we get to the show, kind of our process, we have our different strengths and talents in terms of what we're doing on the road, but typically one person will be taking care of wireless workbench and taking care of the frequencies, while the other person is taking care of getting everything ready that they need to with show wraps and setting the line arrays to the correct settings based on the measurement that they took at the stadium, and so all that stuff that the admin might not know are happening on the back end. It's another one of those places for education where you can say, like, here's what's actually happening. And I understand that that's a financial expense. I find that the biggest pushback is the bunk beds and trying to make all the staff fit. And so our solution has been, if we're ever over bunked, we're happy to stay on an admin bus if we need to. Easy fix, problem solved. There's always extra space on the admin bus. So, and really it was never about the money. I don't think, at least in my situation, it was always about, like, how can I fit this huge staff on entertainers to get from point A to point B? And so being flexible in that area was my fix.
I think for me, that kind of about wraps anything up. Unless you guys have any final thoughts. I appreciate both of you guys, and I appreciate you guys taking the time and hopping on here. This is super great, and I think there's a lot of really awesome nuggets of information in here that a lot of people appreciate and will enjoy quite a bit.
I just want to take a second and say how much I love the materials that you put online, and I'm ashamed to say the number of times that I've sent my clients your videos. When they've got a main stage problem. It is a really great resource, and you're starting to break into the world of not marching people too. I've seen you on the main stage Facebook pages where people are sharing your stuff that have nothing to do with the marching world, and it's a really good resource, and I appreciate you putting the time to make that stuff happen. So
yeah, while we're talking up, James, I make my synth kids part of their band camp, because sometimes it's always hard to and we'll probably actually do this at SEV with the synths there, but it's hard to know, like, what to do with them all the time when everyone else is doing green scales for 4 hours. So they have a playlist, and it takes them like about a whole camp day to get through, and most of them are James's videos, and they have to take notes and like stop and like go to the mixer and like change a setting based on what they learned and stuff. So shout out to, I think I've Venmo'd you a few times maybe if I have to like send a video, but probably not as much as I should. But yeah, shout out to James for the content.
No, great. Yeah. Thank you guys. Yeah. It's all about just creating stuff that I would have died for when I was learning this stuff. And so it's great. I was super fortunate. That stuff for me was just being able to call up Tony Nunez and Kevin Shaw was what I did back in the day, because there were no videos. I would just call them, and they were very gracious to answer and give me answers. So I'm just trying to pay that forward and hopefully help out some people with easy, accessible resources is the goal.